Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Death of Death podcast, where we proclaim Christ's victory over sin, death, and everything else. I'm your host, as always, Nick Stewart. Very excited for this episode. This is our Christmas special. Yes, this time of year, even the frigid German heart of old Saint Nick here is annually warmed by bells and lights and a focus on the incarnation of our Lord. My very good friend Trevor Wright joined me on the podcast to talk about Christmas and Ecclesiastes. We explain the origin of this idea in the interview, but, in short, Trevor did a great study through Ecclesiastes a few years back, and that kind of led into a Christmas outreach that we did called Christmas Under the Sun. So when I was thinking about what to do on the podcast for Christmas, this naturally came to mind, and I had to have him on. So before we get into that, there are two things you should know about Sir Trevor Wright. I knighted him, by the way. Number one, he wrote a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and you should do the same because it helps the show. And number two, he is a Patreon supporter, a member of the elect, which also helps the show immensely. So you should copy him by doing both of those things. And you can join him as a patron by going to deathofdeath.net and clicking Patreon on the menu. And you can also click shop and get yourself a t-shirt or a sticker. All right. I think that's all the business I've got. So let's get into the show for today. I hope you enjoy. Joined today by Trevor Wright, one of the highest rated guests we've ever had, now record holder for most appearances on the Death of Death. Trevor Wright, how you doing?
Doing well, buddy. Trying to hold down my position here on the podcast.
Yeah, well, you're doing great. I'm really hoping to just switch off with you guys so that no one ever takes it away.
Yeah, I gotta have something. I mean, if I can't be hailed as the one who has the best content, I'll be known for the one who's just been on the most amount of times.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that, you know?
Yeah.
Well, what we wanted to talk about today, back when I led worship for a Bible study that you did a harrowing study through the book of Ecclesiastes. And that kind of led into a Christmas event that you put on called Christmas Under the Sun.
Uh-huh.
And so I don't know if you know this, but Christmas is actually soon. And so I thought it might be timely to have you on. It's even snowing here in Oklahoma City today.
Yeah, my kids definitely don't let me forget about it. They wanted We've been singing Christmas music since September. Beginning of September.
That's not allowed.
So
actually, this year it's allowed. Have you noticed that nobody
cared
about
everybody?
It this year?
I was cool with it because it was just like, we're inside. You know what? One thing that they're not going to take away from us is celebrating Christmas in September. So we just took that freedom and ran with it. Yeah.
Well, Joy to the World is one of my favorite songs of all time, regardless. So I would vote to have that one be a year-round classic.
Jingle bells, right up there with it. Yeah.
So first off, tell us a little bit about Ecclesiastes and how we kind of view Christmas in view of our position under the sun.
Sure.
If that's where you'd like to start.
No, that's great. I probably now would be less inclined to do a series through Ecclesiastes just because, I fell in love with the book through the first chapter, and when you get to the book of Ecclesiastes, you realize that you're reading a book of the Bible that's like no other book of the Bible. It sounds more like something from a disenchanted philosophy professor that's just given up a little bit. And it just struck me that something like this was in Scripture. But one of the commentaries that I was referencing at the time of that series was the Reformed Expository Commentary by Douglas Sean O'Donnell, and he references like 3 different quotes from 3 other commentaries, all of which give the idea that Ecclesiastes is just the hardest book of the Bible to interpret. And one of them is the book of Ecclesiastes is like trying to wrangle the 8 legs of an octopus. The moment that you think that you've done it, there's another wiggling in the air, just like pretty much mocking you.
Tapping you on the back of the head.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe that's, something within Ecclesiastes that the author was trying to convey, that, you're not going to get to, completely wrap your hands around this. But well,
I could be wrong, but I would say, aside from Revelation, it's probably the book where 2 completely conservative biblical theologians could have entirely different views of what the book is all about anyway. Like, I mean, there's different views about whether it's right or whether it's wrong. Like it could be right as it's like saying these hopeless things and then kind of saying things about serve God because everything's pointless besides serving God. But then like they also could kind of say like, well, I think it's just like pagan poetry that they put in there to show you that it's the wrong way of thinking. So it's like, it's not even clear like whether this is the right or wrong way to think.
Yeah, exactly. You come to a book of the Bible and you think you're just going to be reading God's truth. So you're reading vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And you just take that as God so loved the world that he gave his one and only begotten son, and paying attention to what's going on within the genre and, theme of the book of Ecclesiastes is really important, or else it'll kind of hit you and you'll realize that there's some tension between what we've become accustomed to reading in the New Testament with all of this imbued meaning through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and then holding Ecclesiastes in your hand and wondering how these 2 puzzle pieces could ever be, put together. But a lot of commentators think that when you come to the preacher of Ecclesiastes, that you're running into something like the voices of Job's friends, where we're not supposed to be taking what they're saying as truth. They're actually an example of how not to think about suffering within that context of Job. And so a lot of people will come to Ecclesiastes and say, well, this is just a long exposition on how not to look at things in this world, and the corrective at the end of it, fear God and keep his commandments, is like, so that was all really stupid, right, guys? You
believe that?
So I don't fall within that camp when I read Ecclesiastes. I think that the way that we would situate Ecclesiastes within the framework of Christmas is to see that the way in which a human being interacts with this world now has been affected by death and the fall. Death being a result and cause of the fall, and Ecclesiastes kind of being like the wasteland of living that's left after that sin entered into the world. You come to Ecclesiastes and you see vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. And that's a lot different than God saying, behold, everything was very good. Reading this after the fall, it gives us an experiential sense of what took place with our work and our life and our sex lives and our happiness and our money and all the pursuits of life within this fallen world. So you have this refrain over and over again in Ecclesiastes of under the sun. And there's a lot of different, as you said, interpretations of how to look at the common themes and phrases in Ecclesiastes, but that under the sun is meant to convey this idea that we of this world, this transitory world, this kind of broken off world from the heavens above us. We're all under the sun. We're all perishable. So we can get into that, but the way that we situate this within Christmas is that this imperishable God decided to make himself into a perishable man for the sake of making that which is perishable, our lives, imperishable, bringing us into his eternity, bringing us past that veil of under the sun and into the heavens. That's, you can stop listening now if you'd like to, because that's what we're going to work towards. But yeah, that's kind of how I would situate it, and that coming down had a real effect on how we now can kind of locate our meaning and purpose and value in the things that we put our hands to in this world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's almost like Jesus was coming to redeem vanity in a sense, because I mean, he was definitely subjected to a lot of, not that he ever felt it was pointless, but he was subjected to a lot of seemingly pointlessness, For
sure. Yeah. I mean, he, is said to be able to sympathize us in all respects. I'm sure he made, maybe a few tables all the way to the end, only to have somebody say, like, that's awful, I don't want it. And it's just like, I made this table from nothing. I don't know for sure, but I mean, definitely being the God man, fully man, he experienced the vanity of this world, so much so that he's able to call it out and say, hey, like, you better be careful about where you're storing up your treasure. In Matthew 6, telling us, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Like, if you look at the end of your treasure, where moth, rust destroys, thieves break in and steal, like, do you really want your life wrapped up in that? Because then your life has the idea is that your life will end in like manner. It's just going to perish and it's gone. So that he was speaking into these things. I mean, he was trying to live against giving himself to those things, obviously, as the perfect Son of God.
Yeah. All right. So after finishing a pretty lengthy study in Ecclesiastes and teaching it very well, I may add, how did you go from that to having the thought of, like, this needs to be a Christmas message and a Christmas outreach, because it was like an outreach to not just Christians. It was kind of an everyone invited sort of thing. So how did that kind of develop?
It came about, one, because I had kind of an apologetic bent. I wanted non-believers to be reached, obviously, as a leader within the church.
Yeah. And, hi,
Cheryl. Yeah, you can see you. She's like ducking down.
Like, I know, I can see her in the mirror.
She says hi.
Yeah.
Hi. And I think every church sees Christmas as a time of year where they realize there's a unique setting within our culture where even non-believers are going to Christmas services. Mm-hmm. And I thought, what better opportunity to maybe meet a non-believer where they are, or possibly just jar them out of just a cultural experience of Christianity, than to have them come to a Christmas service and introduce them to the preacher of Ecclesiastes. It's not the normal nativity message. It's not the normal John chapter 1 message.
You're going back to philosophy class.
Yeah. And, give them something where, it might stick with them a little bit longer than something that they just have already gotten down into a kind of rote memory of, the Jesus birth and stuff like that. And they've already kind of pushed that aside as a fable and a fairy tale. and introduce them to somebody that might jar them a little bit out of that, complacency towards, the faith that has so influenced everything that's around them in the American culture. So the actual idea was planted in me when I was reading the commentary by Douglas Sean O'Donnell. He mentions that, Jesus experienced this vanity and futility that Ecclesiastes talks about. He talks about, him dying is the primary example of this, crookedness and futility and vanity. A man lives a completely perfect life and is tortured, mutilated, and crucified on a cross to be mocked and reviled, by those that he came to redeem. What's more crooked and, vain than that? He mentions that Jesus was born under the sun, and it just so happened that we were, having conversations within our ministry talks about what was going to be going on in Christmas, and I had this idea to do an apologetics event, but I never knew exactly what to do. And when I read that, I was just like, this is perfect. I can have Ecclesiastes and John chapter 1 kind of talk to each other a little bit, not just John chapter 1, but we'll get to it. 1 Corinthians 15. Looking at you, Nick. Quint. But yeah, so this is kind of how it worked out. In Ecclesiastes, we're introduced to Koheleth. That's the name that's given to what the ESV renders the preacher. So it's Koheleth, and Ecclesiastes, it's just assembly. So there's an assembly. So you have the preacher. Some people call him the pastor. Some people just call him the teacher. But the idea is that in the New Testament we have the ecclesiastical church, the assembly of the church, and here in Ecclesiastes we have kind of an assembly that's all gathering around to listen to this teacher. And the first chapter of Ecclesiastes starts out with the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So that famous line, in other translations like the NIV, they'll translate that meaningless. All is meaningless. I don't think that quite gets at exactly what the preacher is meaning by this, because he illustrates what he means by this word, and the Hebrew word is hevel, spelled Hebel, but that B is pronounced with a V, as in Victor, so it's hevel. And one of the commentaries that I've referenced mentions that this is an onomatopoeic word, where you actually have to make the sound that is the definition of what the word means. So there's two breath marks in it, which would make it hevel, and pretty much means breath, or mist, or vapor. Along these lines, the idea is that this is a transitory and passing thing. It's here and it's gone like that.
Like James says, your life is a mist, or a vapor, depending on the translation.
Yeah, exactly.
Different language, but same idea.
Yeah, different language. You have in the Psalms where it speaks of our life as being as a breath. That's hevel. It's this thing that's here and then it's gone. So if you want to think like when it's really cold outside and you let your breath out and it mists for a second, or I guess that's mist or whatever it is, it's there and it doesn't just hang out, it's gone. So that's the idea behind it. And he goes on in verse 3 and says, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? So he already opened up with his premise for everything, and that's that everything is, futile and passing. And he follows it up with a question that has the assumed answer of nothing, which is, what does man gain from everything that he does in this life? And the assumed answer is nothing. He doesn't gain anything. Now, why is that? Well, verse 4, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. So he fixes his thesis that, everything's vanity, everything is futile, and he hinges this on the foundation that, everybody dies. A generation comes and a generation goes, but the earth remains forever. He kind of images the human race like the tide that rolls in, and then the tide rolls out, and just a different generation comes and goes. Nothing is ultimately gained by any generation in any meaningful sense. And I thought that was so interesting, that death was the kind of the foundation on which he built his theology of our fallen life in this world, because that's exactly what the consequence was back in Genesis chapter 3. You have death being a result of sin. And what's interesting is this word vanity in Ecclesiastes is the same as the name for Adam's son Abel, who's the first man to die. So if you look at it, it's Hebel, Hebel. That's the name Abel. So you could do a reading of Ecclesiastes where you see, what does man, Adam, gain from all this toil at which he toils under the sun? Well, vanity. Abel, death. That's what you get.
I mean, and that's what he's saying, is that everything that you can accomplish in terms of family or finances or status or anything, it ends the same way.
Yeah,
exact same way every time. And I mean, that's like a little microcosm of the truth, is that like Adam accomplished this amazing thing by having the first two children in existence, and then what did it amount to?
Right.
Abel died and the other one was banished,
Right, exactly, yeah. And so you have this sin that's causing the result of death, pretty much just ruining the show. And if you try to tie your meaning, purpose, and value to anything within this life, well, death is ultimately standing at the end of that life to wash it all away. And so it wouldn't be a good place to locate your meaning, purpose, and value in life. So much so that even, this isn't something that's unique to the Bible. Leo Tolstoy puts it really poignantly. He says this, Leo Tolstoy says, "My question was the simplest of questions lying in the soul of every man, from the foolish child to the wisest elder. It was a question without an answer to which one cannot live." So you can't live unless you have an answer to this question. As I had found by experience, it was this: what will come of what I am doing today or shall do tomorrow? What will come of my whole life? Differently expressed, the question is, why should I live? Why wish for anything? Or why do anything? It can also be expressed thus: is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy? So that's Leo Tolstoy posing the question that death, begs for us to ask. And you can, obviously do a survey of any 1960s French existentialist philosopher, and you're going to find them ruminating on this meaninglessness and absurd reality that we're all living in by virtue of the fact that we're all going to die one day, and everything that we give ourselves to is ultimately going to end in nothingness. So death isn't just an issue within the framework of the Christian, tradition. It's a problem for everybody. And, Christianity obviously has a unique theological, answer to that in the person and work of Jesus Christ. So.
Yeah. Bad Religion has a song called Destined for Nothing, and the chorus is, headed for eternity and destined for nothing, the future isn't difficult to see. It's easy to confuse grand design with life's repercussions. Lament not your vanquished fantasy. It's only destiny. And I mean, we could talk for an hour about how ironic it would be for that worldview to talk about destiny, but it's clear that everyone has this sense of vanity, and I mean, or things eventually culminating in death, and we all disagree about what happens after that. But I mean, even Bad Religion can tell you that nothing you accomplish here is going to last, because it all ends in death.
Yeah, it's definitely not an easy thing to come to terms with.
But not that everything here is meaningless.
No.
We're definitely not saying that.
Yeah. It's so possibly going on in the book of Ecclesiastes will help us kind of get at this. He, after verse 4, where he mentions a generation coming and going, but the earth remains forever, he illustrates these points with natural events. The sun rises, the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. So interesting thing here, he looks out at the world, sees all these cyclical events where nothing is ultimately being added up or progressed, and he says that's what it's like when we put our hand to something in this world. What's interesting is that he also in verse 8 applies this to us as human beings with being satisfied. He says the eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. And so we too are kind of this image of a cyclical thing where things come into us, but they never fill us, and then they go out from us, and it's never enough, and we crave and we crave and we crave, and there's no ultimate satisfaction from anything that we can get in this world. Now, it is interesting that people will say, like, hey, I'm not a believer in God, and I have all this money, and I have all this satisfaction, I'm doing just fine, so I'm okay. I think the question that would be given to that person by the preacher is, did you keep your wisdom with you? Like when you went into all of that, when you say that, are you keeping in mind in a wise way that you're going to die, and that all of this is going to end? Because that's what's interesting about the preacher. He goes from chapter 1, or actually it's contained within chapter 1. He goes out on this grand adventure to see, what he can give his life to that might satisfy these longings and give him, help him escape this mist of a life. And he says again and again that he keeps his wisdom with him. So he says, I, the preacher, in verse 12 of chapter 1, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with, and I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity, a striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said, in my heart, I've acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this is also but a striving after wind, for in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So he goes into all of this with this wisdom that is surpassed by anybody who had gone before him. in Jerusalem. And he says, I'm gonna keep that wisdom with me as I enter into all these mists and fogs that, people in this world say this is good, this is dry land. And there's actually a poem by William Cooper that I think, at least the beginning of it, illustrates this really well. So William Cooper, you know him by songs, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. He says this at the beginning of his poem on truth. He says, "Man on the dubious waves of error tossed, his ship half foundered and his compass lost, sees far as human optics may command, a sleeping fog and fancies it dry land." So just that first part is talking about, okay, what if we were detached from viewing things the way that God would have us view them? What if we lost that transcendent perspective and just sought to, interact with the things of this world as far as we, can see? Well, the issue with that is that our human optics can only see so far. Our wisdom, our reason can only see so far. And the problem is that we see things that we fancy to be dry land that are in the end just sleeping fogs. And he says, once we see that sleeping fog, we fancy a dry land, we spread all of our canvas, every sinew ply. We pant for it, aim at it, we enter it, and die. Farewell, all self-satisfying schemes, well-built systems, philosophic dreams, deceitful views of future bliss, farewell. We read our sentence at the gates of hell. Not your happy, feel good, Christmas message to be bringing, forward.
Well, thank you for not quoting "It's Not Enough."
Yes, that as well.
That
Thrice,
was the
right?
perfect song, huh?
Thrice?
It was either Thrice or Solo.
Yeah.
But we don't do that ever since he lost his mind. So
yes. What I see the writer of Ecclesiastes doing, and the use of Ecclesiastes for us as New Testament believers in Jesus Christ is, and also for those that just don't believe yet, is creating us in us a void and a hole, much like the hole that's left at the end of the of the Old Testament, where we're all wondering how this is all going to be righted. What's going to take place? Where's this Messiah? And in Ecclesiastes, you might be asking, where's this truth? Where I can finally, lay my hands on something and know that, it's not just a mist. It's not just a wind that, when I go to grasp it, just slips through my fingers and leaves me hopeless.
There's wisdom.
Yeah, where is wisdom? And so it creates into us this kind of ontological longing, because anybody who reads the book of Ecclesiastes, or even reads the literature of 1960s French existentialist philosophers, they're left with kind of this but it doesn't feel meaningless. Like this doesn't feel like it's all vain and futile. But you're left with the hard fact that you're going to die one day. But there's something in us that cries out, but it's still meaningful. Like, it still feels real. It still feels like I'm laying a hold on something that has value and purpose when I do these things. It's just we don't have a foundation to really lay claim on that ontological desire, this thing that screams out from our very being that these things are true. We have, at the end of all of that, just sorry you feel that way, because you're gonna die, and these things ultimately don't add up, and so we're left with kind of like the intermission in all those famous old movies where the conflict has really risen, and it's like we are primed for a resolution, and I think that is what led me so excitedly into doing a Christmas message from this, because I feel like Ecclesiastes just rips a hole in us that's just screaming out to be filled by our God and by eternity. So
do you feel like the book answers that longing?
In a way, I don't think Old Testament. So to put it into another context, I don't think in the Old Testament you had, you know, followers of God who weren't really followers of God or something like that, just because they didn't have the explicit gospel. I think they were looking forward to the Messiah to come, and in that kind of future faith laid hold on the grace of God and the kindness of God, and weren't completely, just, at a loss because they couldn't follow the law perfectly. I think, coming to Ecclesiastes, it's not the full picture, that's for sure. That's why the Gospels were written. That's why Jesus still had to come. So even if you get to the end of Ecclesiastes and you say, here's the end of the matter, fear God and obey his commandments. I think you're still left at a place where you don't exactly know how that adds up, to be an answer to everything here. I think there's an extreme amount of faith in just knowing that God is going to bring about something that makes these things meaningful. And I think what it does provide for us is the answer that, entering into all the different pleasures and pursuits of this life with money and power and women and all other forms of worldliness, that it paints a picture where you're not as inclined to go after those things as happily as you would have before, and that you gladly hold on to the life raft of the fear of God and the keeping of his commandments. And you have this trembling trust that is the solid ground, that while you might not be eternal, while you might be perishable, that God is eternal and he is imperishable, and that he will honor your life given to him in fear and obedience. So I'm by no stretch of the imagination a scholar on the book of Ecclesiastes. I think I've probably read it more than most, just lay Christians, because I had to teach through it, and it's a book that is dear to me. But yeah, I think that's the best that Ecclesiastes can really offer us, and it primes us for the coming of Christ.
Yeah. And might even be the intention of the book being written the way that it is. Might even be the intention to leave you without a lot of answers except for fear God and keep his commandments. And if that's all you have to hold on to, then it means that much more. And it's possible that the author even knew something more was coming in the future that would kind of answer those longings more fully.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. But that would depend on your view of the book.
Yes.
Not everyone's going to agree with that, but
it would. And, I think that, while there might be disagreements on how the book is interpreted, I nevertheless think that, at least what we've gone over today, all Christians would, cling to and hold to be true, that, there is a, to butcher Blaise Pascal, a God-shaped hole within the heart of man that only Christ can fill. Whether or not you draw that truth out of Ecclesiastes or just know it because of other biblical texts, we can affirm that truth. I do think that Ecclesiastes, can and does function in that way, in creating, or at least making us more aware of that hole, so that we're not, drunkenly going through this life, not considering the weight that death places upon us and the effects that it has, simply because we're ignorant of it. That's not a life that I would want. It's not the life that I would want for anybody. I would want them to wake up to what is killing them and is not allowing them to truly enjoy things as much as they could. If that means, kind of, breaking some Christmas ornaments and throwing them all on the ground, metaphorically speaking, I kind of imagine that, it was interesting when I was going through this study, thinking about just the imagery of Ecclesiastes coming into Christmas, and I just imagine him like walking in to a beautifully decorated like Christmas room and like throwing the tree on the floor and like stomping on all the ornaments and like maybe getting us to revile him a little bit, but for the sake of having the best things about Christmas magnified, which is Jesus. So you can look at him as like an Old Testament Grinch that steals all the good things from the Who's down in Whoville, only to have Christmas come. Again, it came all the same, and it came because those things aren't at bottom for Christians. It's Christ. It's imperishable and intangible things that can never be truly taken away from us. And I think for somebody, say there was a Who down in Whoville whose Christmas was ruined when the Grinch took away all of the toys and all of the trees, well, then maybe that might wake them up to the fact that those things aren't the most important. And they might join the chorus of all the other Who's in celebrating Christmas about, with reference to the things that are foundational and that are important. So, that should have been in the Christmas Under the Sun sermon. There should have been a reference to the Grinch story. Sorry, copyright rules. I don't know if we're allowed to talk about that.
As long as we don't play it.
Yeah.
Sure. I'll leave my comments about Newsom being Grinch to myself.
Yeah. Moving into the New Testament from there, I thought that there would be some, evangelistic and apologetic ground to moving forward into the New Testament in the book of the Gospel of John. It's obviously a book that a lot of non-believers are familiar with. They know John 3:16 pretty well, and taking them to what could be called the Christmas text in the Gospel of John. It's John chapter 1, and it's about the Word becoming flesh. And I situated the introduction to the Gospel of John, that prologue, in the idea of logos. So the Greek word in the first chapter of the Gospel of John, the Greek word for word, when it says the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, is logos. And in Stoic philosophy, and to a lot of the Greeks that were living at this time, logos was a very freighted philosophical term. For the Greeks, the Stoics specifically, it spoke of this divine ordering of the world. So they looked out at nature and they saw that they weren't surrounded by chaos, and that when chaos did come about, that order nevertheless always followed that chaos. And so they saw these things that we might today call, the laws of nature. A rose by any other name would still smell just as logical. And for the Greeks, it was looking out of this world, seeing that there was this divine logos, this ordering to the world that then kind of grounded their own logos, logic and reason, internally. So this must be this ordering out here in the world must also be what enables us to be wise and ordered within our thoughts and life with regards to ethics and the good life. That's the question, for the Greeks. What is the good life? And that's what their philosophy was all about. Um, and I had been reading Luc Ferry's A Brief History of Thought. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Paris, and he talks a lot about the Logos and the Stoics, but then he moves on to Christianity, and he says this in his book, A Brief History of Thought. He says, firstly and most fundamentally, the Logos, which, as we have seen for the Stoics, merged with the impersonal, harmonious, and divine structure of the cosmos as a whole, came to be identified for Christians with a single and unique personality, that of Christ. To the horror of the Greeks, the new believers maintained that the Logos, in other words, the divine principle, was in no sense identical with the harmonious order of the world, but was incarnated in one outstanding individual, namely Christ. So I thought that this might be a useful bridge between Christians and non-believers in Christmas time to think about this divine ordering, because Ecclesiastes shows that this blueprint behind your life and what you should give yourself to and all that, it was broken in the fall. And it's not as easily accessible right now because we're surrounded by so much broken stuff. And it's not easy to really come to terms with what the good life is, because it seems like the good life ends. And if the good life
seems
ends,
that way.
If the good life ends, then what is the point of giving yourself to all of these things? If we are all here in this broken world, living under the sun, we might have fear God and follow His commandments, but what does it actually look like to live and give ourselves to our daily things in the monotonous, chorus of life? When we wake up, what gives meaning to me making breakfast for my family and taking care of the chores and paying the bills and all of that, that day in, day out stuff. And for the Greeks, this blueprint was kind of this impersonal outside force where they saw in nature an order to things, and they then acknowledged an order within their own lives and attempted to kind of build on logic and reason towards that good life, all the while ignoring probably not. I'm also not an expert on Greek thought. This idea of death. I'm sure you had existentialist thoughts, within Greek thought just as much as you do here in Scripture. At least things that are flavored with that kind of thing, and obviously in our own recent history with French existentialism. But having all of these streams, coming together and having this one big issue of what does that good life look like? How do we give ourselves to the things that we put our hands to in this world, and how do we interact with that with a reference to meaning, purpose, and value? Here's the Gospel of John coming in and saying that blueprint and that way of living is actually, it's been manifested now in the fleshly incarnation of God in the man Jesus Christ, and that this life acts like a light in the darkness, that for all of human history, there's just been a darkness with reference to sin and to guilt, but also darkness with regards to our experience as being even the people of God living under the sun. And here comes Christ, this beam of light that is that blueprint, that is that logos, that is that order that we've all been desiring. And that's an interesting way to look at the incarnation and the birth story of Jesus, that in coming, Jesus not only comes, obviously, to free us from the guilt and the due justice for our sins, but by virtue of that opens up to us this new way of living. So we're told in John chapter 10 that he didn't come, that the thief comes to steal and to destroy and to kill, but that Christ came to give us life, and that more abundantly. Now, that life more abundantly isn't just look at what Jesus did and then do that. It's that this life abundantly is now accessible for those that are found in him by faith. That when his life becomes your life now can look a lot different in the day in, day out here in this world.
It's bringing meaning
pretty much
into the day in, day out.
Yeah, exactly. And so, John chapter 1, beautiful, passage, speaking of the Word becoming flesh, and this Word being eternal, and this Word being God, and this Word being that which created all things that have been made. I mean, you have the Logos, you have the blueprint behind the world, you have the carpenter himself, displaying for you what this life is meant to be, and then paying the price so that that life can be yours. That's the twofold work of Christ in answering the quandaries of Ecclesiastes, not just showing us how to live life, but then actually giving us access to that life through his death and resurrection. So this is what's interesting. And I don't know if Paul did this on purpose, but after reading Ecclesiastes, and especially the first 2 chapters really thoroughly, and reading the Gospel of John, you come to 1 Corinthians 15, and you find that death and vain labor is juxtaposed. And so you come to 1 Corinthians 15, and we'll start at verse 51. Paul says, "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but all shall be changed in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" And you get a sense of what that victory is in death and that sting is of death by reading Ecclesiastes. Man, does it sting. After you read that first chapter of Ecclesiastes, there is a sting to death. There is a wiping away of what was done in my life. If death is all that I have to look forward to, and all that comes to bear upon what I did in my life. But then in verse 56 of 1 Corinthians 15, it says, "The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." Why? Because he died, and because his death paid the penalty of that sin. And so now the victory is robbed from death and granted to the sons and daughters of God. That's the gospel, right?
Yeah.
Verse 58, directly following that. Therefore, what's the point of all of that gospel? Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in what? The work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain.
Wow.
So I don't know if he was reading Ecclesiastes or not. And honestly, I don't know the play between the word hevel and the Greek word used here in 1 Corinthians 15. But it's interesting to me that right after going into probably one of the most beautiful tellings of the gospel, you have death being brought up as the big issue and Jesus being the big solution, and therefore what you do in this world, in your work, being for the Lord, no longer being in vain. And so in situating Ecclesiastes with the Christmas story, we see that the problems that are brought up in Ecclesiastes, namely that because of death, all the things that we put our hands to in this life don't fill us, and they don't ultimately amount to anything, are then answered in the life of Christ, in his defeating the power of death by being the ransom and the payment for our sin, and therefore bringing us into his eternal life, so that death ultimately doesn't hold its victory over the things that we've done in this life, but allows those things to speak a better word, echoing out for all of eternity to the glory of God. And so we are anchored into his side now. We're anchored into the life of Christ in such a way that what we do might as well be the things that he is doing. Our work is now caught up in the work of Christ. And if his work can't be in vain, and if his work is eternal, then what we do in this world for his sake is also eternal, and it's no longer in vain. And so a life of supreme satisfaction, purpose, and value is offered to us in Christ. And so that makes Christmas and God coming down and entering into this vanity to bring us up out of it a pretty amazing and beautiful thing.
Yeah. Well, that's an amazing parallel that I've never noticed in 1 Corinthians 15, and I think you're right, and you could probably say a little more strongly that he was probably alluding to Ecclesiastes, because I think he quotes Ecclesiastes earlier in that chapter, and he's saying if we're not resurrected, if we're not raised, then eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die.
Right.
Which I don't know if that quote originates with Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes itself may have been quoting something, but I think it's highly likely that Paul was in an Ecclesiastes frame of mind.
Yeah, I think if any writing was probably on his mind as a Jewish scholar, he had definitely read his Ecclesiastes. So yeah, it's a different way of viewing Christmas that I think gives just a really full-bodied expression to what Christ came to do. There's so many sides to looking at what Christ accomplished. The foundational thing is he took death away, and he took away the sin that would have wrapped us up in the side of death. But then by virtue of that, I mean, it's a whole new life that is accessible to those who are now in Christ. We can sweep a floor to the glory of God now and know for certain that Jesus honors that, and that God honors that, and that is not in vain. So from the meanest to the most lofty of pursuits that we could give ourselves to in this world, we get to wake up and say, as unto the Lord, and find all the joy and satisfaction in the world doing whatever we're going to do. Yeah. So it's Leo Tolstoy, could have done a lot better if he had the answer of Jesus, and obviously he had some aspect of faith in his life. I wouldn't say it was in any way orthodox, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that just captures so well how worldly philosophies do fall short. When you were talking about the logos, or logos, whatever. I'm done having that debate. When you were talking about that, and you were mentioning how the Stoics, or I don't know if you said the Stoics or just Greek philosophers in general, had sort of this idea that nature was ordered, and that's just such a common thing throughout all history for us to see some sort of scientific order to seemingly random things, and chaos theory actually is that exact thing. Chaos theory is essentially saying, like, yeah, there's all these sort of random things that can, make a pool ball get shot a little differently depending on, how round the ball is, and if it's a perfect circle, and the slant of the table and the cue and all this stuff. But we can mathematically predict all those things if we can just think about it ahead of time.
Yeah.
And what I realized is that it's amazing that chaos theory is essentially trying to bring order out of chaos, which, is just an interesting thought. But through this conversation, I've realized that even if you could do that, chaos theory can't give you a reason for the ball to go in the hole. And chaos theory doesn't take away the fact that your pool victories go away when you die.
Yeah.
So there's still this problem of death left over after all of the philosophizing and ordering of seemingly random things that we can possibly think of.
Yeah. It's like getting an X-ray at the doctor. It doesn't fix the problem.
Yeah.
It might show you exactly what's going on, and that to the finest detail, but it doesn't take away the fact that there's a problem. You need a physician for that, not just a picture.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And only other thing I was thinking about, and then if you have some parting thoughts, we can wrap up after this. But I remembered what I was trying to say earlier that I forgot because I'm stupid. Was
No.
Jesus was subjected to this vanity or this meaninglessness in a way, and like in the death of Jesus, like in the idea that this was just a really nice moral teacher who just got caught up in the wrong crowd and got killed, which is kind of a myth that persists to this day and was definitely popular in the first century. There was a certain amount of meaninglessness to that and a certain amount of vanity, but just like his death, where it seemed he's dead now and the plan has failed, that was the very thing that completely was reversed to redeem us from the death, and that vanity is completely reversed to redeem us from that vanity. So it's amazing. The very thing that looks like the problem is reversed to our benefit by the plan of God.
Yeah, some might even say that is the death of death.
Some may say that. The death of death, if you will.
Yes, exactly it.
Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say, have a Merry Christmas, and have a Merry Christmas, not because you haven't kept your wisdom with you, but because you have, and you've faced the hard realities of death, and are nevertheless able to have joy in knowing that you're no longer attached to that in the way that you were prior to knowing Jesus, and that the life that you live the day after Christmas has a lot more to say now that you're owned by Christ and that you've given yourself to the things of God through Jesus. Truly, the disparate notes within life are a hard thing to deal with. Ecclesiastes is real about those things. And just because you've given yourself to the Lord doesn't mean that those disparate things go away. It's just that you know that there's an answer to them, and that all of this is going to culminate in a very good ending, and that you can be certain of that in as much as you're certain of Jesus. So Merry Christmas, and to all of us, a good night.
Well, thanks, Trevor. Thank you so much for your time. I value your time, as I know that you do, so I appreciate you taking the time to do this.
There's a time to
love.
So there's a time to read, there's a time for war, and there's a time for peace, and sometimes there's a time for a podcast.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Not often enough, but sometimes.
More often than any other interviewee. So
That's
just want to remind
record holder.
No matter what you might think about me.
Yeah, it's true.
Let that be known.
Record holder. All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Trevor. Merry Christmas to you.
You too, buddy. Bye.
All right, that was Trevor Wright, stylish and well-spoken as always. I hope you all have a good Christmas. See your relatives, give and receive gifts, go to church, lick some doorknobs. Don't let your governor steal your memories. That's going to do it for today, and I'll catch you guys next week, all right?